This this is the Impressions Exchange podcast.
Impressions Exchange podcast,
where all topics impacting the graphic imaging and printing industry are addressed via in-depth news coverage, analysis, and timely interviews.
Welcome to the Impressions Exchange podcast. I'm Ashley Roberts, managing editor and your host for today's episode. It's April, which means it is Earth Month. So we are going to be talking about sustainability today. It's my pleasure to be joined by my colleague, Gary Jones, Vice President, Environmental, Health, and Safety Affairs at Printing United Alliance, who will walk us through some of the latest legislative and regulatory updates on the sustainability front. We will also discuss how generational shifts might impact the industry and why you need to establish metrics and develop your sustainability game plan now. Gary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, Ashley, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I really enjoy talking about one of my favorite subjects, sustainability.
Yes, and it's the perfect month because it is Earth Month, and we are going to be celebrating Earth Day. So yeah, I wanted to have you come on here because I know you are really tapped into this side of the industry. And you know, I'd love to start out by just talking about some of the trends. And I know prior to this call, we went through some things, and you mentioned some, changes in paper and soy and forest degradation. I mean, there's so many different aspects of, the sustainability side of the industry. So can you just talk through some of those trends and some of the things that are happening that the printing industry should know about?
Oh, yeah. Sustainability, it's interesting. Sustainability isn't necessarily new, so to speak. It's been around for a while, but I would say in the past, probably 4 years or so, 5 years, it's really become front and center again. It has historically been an important issue, and then it kind of waned a little bit, and then it came back. But there's been a series of events, I would say, that's triggered why sustainability has come back and is in the forefront. When we think about what's happened, primarily, a lot of it was triggered when China decided to stop becoming the world's dumping ground for everyone's garbage. They called it the SWORD program or the Blue Sky program. In essence, what China was accepting a lot of waste from people all around the world, not just United States. And I thought, boy, I was fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak, because I thought was doing my part, because where I live here in Pittsburgh, we have the Blue Bin program. And what you do in the Blue Bin program is, of course, you put recyclables in there, and once a week a truck comes by and it gets dumped in the truck, and away it goes. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm recycling, I'm doing my part. The reality behind the scenes is that, once where's that truck go? What goes to what's called a material recovery facility, MRF, MRF for short. And what happens then is they kind of just literally dump it on the floor, and they run it through some machines, and they pick through it, and they pick out the things that have some type of economic value from a recyclability perspective. And then they were just bailing the stuff up and sending it to China. And then China would do the same thing. They'd pick through it, pick out a few things, and then they realized that, man, we've got all this garbage we don't know what to do with. And so they decided to stop taking all the garbage from the world, literally. And it wasn't just US, it was all over the world. And that really triggered that in conjunction with the ocean plastics. You saw a big push on ocean plastics, and it was really raised the awareness and consciousness of people. And if we fast forward to today, what we're seeing is the net result of that literally was that now the government's being involved. And what we mean by that is we're now starting to see legislation passed. We're seeing regulations that are being passed. Two most recent things that really have driven this point home is literally last month, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, issued regulations for publicly traded companies that they now have to start reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions. They cut back their rule from their proposal by insisting that Scope 3, well, by dropping Scope 3, but insisting that Scope 1 and Scope 2 are the greenhouse gas emissions that must be reported. And you couple that with California. California, again, last year passed two pieces of legislation, but the most important one is that it requires companies of a certain size to report their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so that's really driven a lot of attention with respect to sustainability. And because of the China Sword program, you have what's called the environmental results, not environmental results, the extended producer responsibility. Extended producer responsibility legislation essentially makes the goal of extended producer responsibility is to make the owner of a package responsible for its ultimate fate. And so 4 states have passed EPR legislation, and New York State, as we have talked about, New York State is considering EPR legislation. And that piece of legislation is a little bit different because it adds on to it some toxics and packaging requirements. And those toxics and packaging requirements are going after some chemicals. And one of the chemicals is something that's critically important for the printing industry, and it's called carbon black. And carbon black is used, it's the primary pigment that's used in black ink. So if the New York legislation passes as proposed, it's really going to threaten both, I would say, the printing and packaging industry, but also the economy of New York State, because in essence, it's going to ban pretty much all forms of packaging that have any black ink on it. And that includes just, direct printing on the packaging, but also the labels that go on a package. And so we've been engaged since this legislation was proposed at the beginning of the year quite intensely in trying to engage our members. And in fact, we have an action alert up there. If our members want to find out how they can do more, they can reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to guide them in terms of getting a letter to the legislator. But so the EPR legislation that's pending in New York isn't necessarily the only one, but it's the only one with toxics provisions in it. There's probably about 13 other states right now that are considering EPR legislation, coupled with the 4 states that have already passed it. Clearly, we're seeing a lot more government interaction trying to address sustainability. And the best way I try to summarize this is that while at one time sustainability was a nice thing to do, at this point it's a must thing to do. And if any printing company, literally any printing company, needs to understand the ground shift that's happened with respect to sustainability, and really start thinking about what their role is with respect to sustainability. Another term that we use is circular economy. But where are they in terms of their sustainability journey? And I call it a journey because it's really, you think about sustainability, it's really a continuous improvement project. So they need to start planning where they are. They need to start thinking about how they're going to address sustainability. And quite frankly, we're seeing more and more customers who are asking down through their supply chain information from their suppliers. And no matter what vertical you're in printing, you're in somebody's supply chain. And what we're seeing with respect to the focus on the supply chain, literally, a lot of it is dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And, they want to know, what are your greenhouse gas emissions? What's your quote unquote carbon footprint? And then what are you doing to reduce that? Because a lot of the larger companies have made commitments to try and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but that involves actually going down through their supply chain. And that's kind of gets at the California requirement, because the scope 3 emissions are basically your upstream and downstream emissions. And in the SEC originally had that in their proposal and then withdrew it because of a lot of controversy, a lot of pushback. So those are the 2 primary drivers right now out there from a regulatory and legislative perspective. And because they're controversial, there's been lawsuits filed on both of them. So that's something that we're monitoring and reporting back out to our membership regarding those lawsuits. But again, I think it's here to stay. And I've been doing a lot of reading on that. And the speculation essentially is that even though the lawsuits are there, they don't see this scope 3, scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting going away, primarily because a lot of the larger companies have made commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and that those reductions include going through the supply chain.
Really interesting. So you mentioned, the SEC ruling, the EPR legislation, and kind of the overall kind of sea change toward more sustainable practices, and the need for companies to kind of shift the way they've been doing things. And something interesting you'd brought up prior to this call, was that, that's not only affecting the, the actual processes that printing companies need to implement because of different rulings. Sustainable practices are also going to potentially impact the workforce, and that the types of people and the younger generations coming into, it's something we talk about all the time. Printing companies are struggling in some cases with the labor force and finding new, younger generations to come in and work for their companies. And that's something that's very important to younger generations. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we are at the beginning of a significant change with respect to the way that, again, sustainability is here to stay, with the way that companies view sustainability. And the drivers in this are, as we had chatted about, is really Gen Z. And Gen Z is very fascinating because at one time everyone thought, oh, it was the millennials that were going to be the drivers of change. And really, the millennials didn't embrace sustainability the way that Gen Z has done. Gen Z, I would say, it's hard to make these broad, these broad assumptions, but for the most part, a lot of the studies I've been seeing, Gen Z has literally internalized sustainability. And they're saying they're truly the real first like digital generation. And Gen Z has, to the point where they're looking at making decisions on employment, they're making decisions on purchasing, and through that lens that they're using, they're of course applying those value judgments and making life decisions with respect to what type of company do they want to work for. And so from a printing perspective, traditionally, we've not really, I think, looked at that from a recruiting perspective, but I think it has to be now part of the arsenal to try to attract young people into the printing industry. And as I mentioned, I just literally read an article this morning of where, again, Gen Zs are tending to shy away from college bound types of careers. And they are seeking more vocational type careers. And that's actually perfect for the printing industry, because we need to get more younger people into the industry. We need that new generation coming in. We need to attract the younger people. And so as part of the arsenal that you have in terms of, wages and benefits, you also need to be able to talk about what you're doing from a sustainability perspective, and what is the company's commitment to sustainability, and what has the company accomplished with respect to sustainability. How are they working with their customers? How are they working through their supply chain to understand and reduce the impact that they're having, on the environment or on the earth as a global situation. And so, it's interesting because, it takes generational change, and everyone that I've read has been studying Gen Z way better than I have, are saying that we're seeing the generational change with Gen Z. And what's interesting is, of course, Gen Z, the older, it spans, probably I think about a decade, but the older Gen Z folks are becoming part of the workforce, and some of the statistics are, upwards of like 20% of the workforce are Gen Z right now, and they're entering into the workforce. And of course, as they follow their career path, they're going to become supervisors, managers. They're going to become vice presidents. They may purchase companies. They're going to become upper management, and they're going to be using, their internalized, values to run their company. And so I think it's very interesting, very fascinating as to where we are with the change in the approach, and that's really driving. You look at marketing and advertising. Marketers and advertisers on a global scale understand the trends, and you've noticed a lot of changes in marketing that they're gearing up towards the Gen Z consumer, because they're going to be, of course, consuming. And as they move through the workforce and generate more income, they'll have more disposable income. So it is interesting in terms of where we're moving.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It's not something that I, really had thought about prior to you mentioning that was something that we need to be thinking about, that these younger generations. I mean, I'm a millennial and I'm very, tuned in to sustainable efforts, but even more so, Gen Z and not so much millennials. So, which is who the printing companies are probably trying to go after now for part of their workforce. So, something that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is that for, all companies, it's sustainability and implementing more sustainable practices is a journey. And so I'm curious if you could just, if companies are looking to be more sustainable, and even if there isn't legislation impacting them directly right now in their state, if they want to start being more sustainable and they want to, make small changes, what are some places that they can start, or where are some places they could start?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think, I look at it, as I said, the journey, and some companies are further along than other ones. Some are just starting, some it's maybe on the radar screen. But regardless of where they are, I think the very first thing that a company needs to do is to establish some metrics. And the reason why I say that is that the most critical part of sustainability is credibility and transparency. So in order to be credible and be transparent and tell a good story about your journey and what you're doing, you need to be able to understand where you're at and what actions that you've taken, what is the net result of those actions. And so you need to be able to describe those. So in the core of anything from a sustainability perspective is going to be metrics. And what I mean by metrics is, as we mentioned, greenhouse gas calculations. That could be a challenge. We do have a calculator, by the way, for our members for Scope 1 and Scope 2. And Scope 3, we're working on a solution. Scope 3 is a little bit more complex. But you need to look at, well, how much solid waste am I generating? But not just solid waste as a whole. How much material am I recycling? How much material am I generating that I could recycle? What am I doing to reduce my energy consumption? When you look at the printing industry, at least from a greenhouse gas perspective, the two primary drivers that are the most significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions are going to be energy consumption and substrate. So you want to look immediately at energy consumption. What can you do to reduce your energy use? Because when you reduce your energy use, and actually a lot of folks think, well, sustainability costs me a lot of money. But in essence, in a lot of cases, sustainability can save you a good bit of money too. What do I mean by that? Energy consumption. It's a win-win-win. If I can take steps and measures to reduce my energy consumption, I reduce my electricity bill, I reduce my cost, I'm increasing potentially my profitability, and I'm also reducing the burden on the environment, because a lot of the electricity that we still get today, at least in the US, is fossil fuel driven. And yes, there are renewable resources coming online, and more of our energy mix is coming from renewable resources, but still we generate a lot from fossil fuels. And to some extent, we're moving away from coal, but they're using natural gas to generate electricity. So it's much cleaner than coal-fired electricity, but there's still a lot of electricity that's generated using fossil fuels. So reducing your energy consumption, as I said, is a win-win-win all the way around. But you really, if you're just starting your program, you start small. You want to start with small projects, and just on energy consumption, maybe you're gonna, I know it seems kind of cliche now, but you look at your lighting systems. Can we swap out our lighting systems and move towards a more efficient method to light our facility? Look at occupancy sensors. It's interesting. I was talking, I forget who I was talking to the other day. Talking to actually he'll be my nephew, and he's an electrician. He's an apprentice, and they're doing a lot of wiring at a local university. And in that wiring process, they're literally putting individual control units on the light banks that are in rooms so that they can have central control over the electricity. So what that does is allows their facilities people to monitor the rooms because they have occupancy sensors. They see that there's nobody in there, they turn the lights off. It saves the university a ton of money. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and those are, occupancy sensors are pretty reasonable. Occupancy sensors are great, and literally, growing up, I always told my kids, make sure you turn the light off when you leave the room, but of course they never did. But literally, you want to train your employees that if they're leaving the room, they don't need the light on, they can turn off the light. There's energy saving functions on your computer. So it doesn't have to be a grand, like, oh, Gary, do I have to invest in a solar system? Of course, there's, doing solar powered is tremendous because it's a renewable resource. It cuts your dependency on the grid. But, of course, we know it's not inexpensive, but there have been incentives that have been passed and extended through the Infrastructure Improvement Act. No, infrastructure, it's the IRA Act. And but there's credits now for companies, both on a federal level and at the state level too. A lot of states are offering credits, and to some extent, power companies are also offering credits. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out solar, so to speak, but that's a big investment. But we do have printing companies that are making those investments in solar, and there are tax credits out there that are available for folks who want to go down that route. But I encourage folks, start small. There's a lot that you can do that are really low cost or no cost ways to implement energy efficiency, energy reduction. And fascinating too, when I was at our show at the expo, I'm starting to see now vendors who are talking about energy consumption for the equipment. So I find that fascinating as well. It isn't necessarily, well, my particular piece of equipment can do this performance, it can do that from a production perspective. They're also talking about how we compare to our competitors on energy consumption. And I think that's really, really interesting, because now we're starting to see, as I said, sustainability is really coming to the forefront. And when you have that as a selling feature for your piece of equipment, that means that it's really become mainstream in my mind.
Yeah. That's I love the fact that you said start small. I think that's it maybe can seem overwhelming for companies, but starting small is a great piece of advice. And I think we all have the universal experience of our father telling us to turn the lights off, because I had that experience too. And I know you just said you would say it, to your kids. So it's I love that.
Yeah, isn't it funny how you become your parents when you have children? So
yes. Well, I find, and it's funny, I find myself going around turning lights off all the time now. But yeah, so it's great advice. Is there anything else that you think that we haven't covered that you think might be beneficial to tell our audience?
yeah, I mean, I can't stress enough in terms of where sustainability has evolved and where it's at right now. And really, I think, to me, companies have got to come up with a plan. It could be a small plan, it could be a large plan, it could be grandiose. But as part of their planning for their business and growth and looking at how they want to expand, they need to put sustainability into that discussion. And the more that we have that discussion, the more that ideas will come forward, the more that folks will begin to operate along those lines from a sustainability, integrating sustainability. And I think what we found, for example, a lot of times, another example is solid waste. Solid waste is huge. And the more you can separate, the more you can segregate, the more that you can recycle. And that, again, provides a great benefit and value back to the company. And in some instances, you're able to sell those materials and make some money off them. In other instances, you're able to find an outlet and you can report that as far as your metrics and reducing your impact. So you gotta have a story to tell. And I guess the key question is, what story do I want to tell? What story can I tell, or what story do I want to tell? And then that will show you essentially a gaps analysis and tell you where you want to be.
Thank you so much, Gary. This was a great discussion, and perfect for April to get people thinking about how they're going to develop their sustainability game plan.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be Earth Day. Earth Day is a great time to actually talk about what you're doing. Even if you're starting small, if you are going to embrace this, Earth Day is a great time to start communicating to what we call your stakeholders. That's going to be your employees, your customers, your vendors. There's no other better day of the year to kick off a program than Earth Day.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Gary, and I hope to have you back on the show soon.
All right. Thank you, Ashley.
I want to thank Gary for joining me on today's episode. I will make sure to link to the Printing United Alliance website if you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we discussed today. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Impressions Exchange podcast.